Hey, what is happening, gamers? It is The Honest Gamer here, and this week I am bringing you the last episode in the series of the history of Final Fantasy. And once again, you have your chance to comment in the comment section below or on Facebook and Twitter to give your say in what series should be covered next. During this last episode, we will be covering Final Fantasies 12 to 14. So, here is the 5th and final episode. Enjoy. Final Fantasy XII was released in 2003 and would be the last game to be sold exclusively for the PlayStation, as well as the last Final Fantasy title to be made for the PlayStation 2. As was commonplace with new games in the series, the 12th game would continue to set the trend of adding new elements. This time it could be seen in the form of a complete change-up of the battle system and also the game's job system. You play as the young and energetic Vaan, who lives in the kingdom of Dalmasca, a small land wedged between two much larger warring nations. When the war grows close, the kingdom of Arcadia invades Dalmasca. The princess Ash, who has lost both her husband and father during the invasion, then begins to plot and build a rebellion, and is subsequently aided by Vaan and other adventurers who help the cause. During this title, the player will meet Dr. Sidolphus, who for the first time in the series pitted the reoccurring character Sid as an enemy boss. Improvements were vast and gameplay was changed greatly by continuing the loss of the world map first started back with the 10th game, and also continued was the different battle system seen in Final Fantasy XI Online. During the game you would enter seamless battles in the very same area you explore on foot, rather than being taken to another screen to do battle as you would have previously. The new combat system was dubbed the Active Dimension Battle or the ADB system. Moving on, in addition to the standard leveling up from gaining experience points, Final Fantasy XII introduced the brand new license board, which consisted of an array of different panels which would allow for characters to obtain and use certain abilities. Again, the travelling of the overworld, as it was now called, could be done by riding on the back of the ever faithful Chocobo, or just on foot and by airship later on. A final new feature seen in the game was the use of gambits, which would basically control your party's actions should certain scenarios come about. For example, you could set a gambit for a healer to auto-target and cast a healing spell on a party member whose health had dropped below 70%. Final Fantasy XII was praised almost entirely by reviewers worldwide. It was yet again another massive commercial and critical success, selling over 5 million copies around the globe. Reviewers hailed the game's seamless transition between full motion video and the in-game engine. They also praised its storyline, new gameplay elements, its improvement in graphics, and finally the freshness it brought to the series. The only downside was that IGN stated they felt it had a weaker soundtrack but still strong overall. This could have been due to the fact that Nobu Uematsu didn't actually score this game, having left Square Enix in 2004. But GameSpot hailed the new Gambit system but criticised it for being too difficult for newer players to understand and pick up. The decision to move away from random encounters was present from the start of production back in 2001, and the game's director Hiroyuki Ito was clear that this was the best path to continue the series forward with new plans to evolve the franchise, and it was clearly a popular move with fans. Square were now finished with the PlayStation 2 and had taken its series as far as possible on the console, and development was already well underway in 2004 to begin creating the newest installment for the next generation consoles, and not just Sony's. Released in Japan on December 17, 2009, and to the rest of the world the following year, Square Enix unveiled their newest chapter in the series, Final Fantasy XIII. This title will be the first to be unleashed onto two next-generation consoles, both Sony's PlayStation 3 and Microsoft's Xbox 360, which proved to be a popular move, boosting the game's sales across two platforms. The story puts you in the boots of the female lead character, Lightning. As a former soldier of the floating world Cocoon high above the feared land below called Pulse, she begins to fight the government of Cocoon called the Sanctum, when helpless civilians are purged when it is believed that they have come into contact with Pulse. Soon a group begins to form around her, and together they take on the Sanctum and attempt to find out what their assigned task is to avoid being turned into a monster. The game was vastly changed to previous installments when Square Enix brought their series to the newest generation of consoles. Firstly, a brand new graphics engine called the Crystal Tools engine was designed. This was used to create incredibly lifelike character animations never seen before in the franchise. The game also boasted a faster rate of combat with a couple of differences, mixing up the battle systems seen in Final Fantasy XII and previous titles, in which during your journey you will encounter enemies wandering on the map, but if you come into contact with these you will enter a different battle screen, so really it was a mixture from previous titles. During combat you have a maximum of 3 characters, however you will only control one of these, with the other 2 being controlled by the Artificial Intelligence or AI. The game uses a similar method to control attacks as Hiroyuki Ito's ATB system, used since Final Fantasy IV. During this title there will be an ATB gauge which fills during battle a few slots which can be increased later as you progress, allowing you to perform certain normal attacks or magical attacks depending on how many slots you have filled. Finally, on combat, every enemy has a chain counter. The more you attack, the more it rises, leading to what is called a stagger, causing the enemy to be flung into the air and have a lower defense, making attacks on it much more deadly. The final difference was the use of the Crystarium system, which resembled the sphere leveling grid seen in Final Fantasy X. During the game, as you win battles, you will gain points, which can then be used to make your way around the new grid, upgrading your skills under certain job roles as it were. Cid made his appearance during this title as Cid Rains, and is a commander of an airship called the Lindblom. The game enjoyed a large degree of positive reviews, however there were a few negative points raised which did lower its overall score by a fair amount. These included how linear the game had been created, with hours upon hours spent from travelling along a predetermined A to B, only to move onto a whole other map with a new A to B point. The largest amount of praise was given to the graphics and the artwork that went into creating the game's world. Also up there was the increased pace of battle, and the story enjoyed mostly positive praise. The 13th game in the series sold very well around the world, selling in Japan more than 1 million units in the first day, and more than 6.2 million copies worldwide as of May 2010, and is the fastest selling game in the franchise. Although reviewers weren't overly as positive as they had been for nearly all of the previous installments, it was the game's financial success that prompted them to create the second sequel seen in the series since Final Fantasy X. Released to Japan on December 15th, 2011, and to North America and Europe in January and February 2012 respectively, this game was as stated the sequel to its successful prequel. Taking place 3 years after the end of the previous game, Final Fantasy XIII-2 follows the characters Sarah Farron, Lightning's younger sister, and a young man named Noel, as they attempt to find the missing Lightning. The new game sought to right the wrongs of the previous title in the eyes of the reviewers, so developers concentrated on what the feedback was and how to fix it. Combat, which was praised in the prequel, was left almost entirely untouched, with the only aspect being changed is that your enemies no longer appear on the map. Instead, just like in previous installments, you will randomly enter battles. The team working on the game also did away with the highly criticised linear aspect seen in the last game, instead promoting a much more open style of gameplay, with branching paths opening the way for newer areas to be accessed. Two more features were that often when speaking to characters, the game sometimes begins the live trigger system, in which you choose their response based on up to 4 choices, and these dialogue options were generally not repeatable. The game also on occasion featured temporal rifts, in which you the player had to complete a puzzle in order to close the rift and continue the game. The overall reception was much higher than its prequel had seen, with reviewers stating almost entirely that all of the criticised elements of Final Fantasy XIII had been fixed and made for a much more enjoyable game. Overall, the game as stated performed well to reviewers. The only downside was that it didn't sell incredibly well, selling close to 525,000 copies in Japan during its first week, and by the end of 2011 had sold close to 700,000 units. Final Fantasy XIV Online released in September 2010, with the initial plan of creating a port for the PlayStation 3 close behind. However, due to very high amounts of criticism and negative reviews due to reviewers stating the game had been released and pushed out too early, the plans for the port for the PlayStation 3 have been pushed right back to allow Square Enix to instead continue the work on improving nearly all aspects of the game to make the PlayStation 3 version unique and not just a straight port of what is essentially to many a largely unfinished game. The idea is that in late 2012 to early 2013, Final Fantasy XIV 2.0 will incorporate a new graphics engine, new server and data structures, a revamped interface, newly redesigned maps, more gameplay variations and content, and new playable sexes of certain races. Final Fantasy XIV 2.0 is planned to coincide with the PlayStation 3 release of the game. The story will see players set in a world where the strongest of nations have been constantly at war with each other, until a mysterious empire from the east raised the mightiest of city-states. The nations then decide that if they are to repel the invaders, then they will have to band together. However, the empire never came, and instead what did come was a peace not seen before between the two nations, leading to soldiers and mercenaries without a job, forming guilds and going by a new name, adventurers. The new game will feature a system close to that of Final Fantasy II's skill-based progression system, using weapons and skills to build your character. The reception was almost entirely poor across the board, with the president of Square Enix stating that the Final Fantasy brand has been greatly damaged, and asked fans of the series for patience whilst the development team was reshuffled. A new director was put in place of Nobuyuki Komoto, and the game's producer Hiromichi Tanaka was also replaced. Both roles would instead be filled by Naoki Yoshida. The game was slated for its bad interface, quest restrictions, and awful player and non-playing character economy as stated by GameSpot, with reviewers 1UP.com stating that they couldn't recommend it to anyone in its current state. As a result of these poor reviews, Final Fantasy XIV Online sold only 190,000 copies in Japan, 210,000 in North America, and 230,000 in Europe by November 2010. Because of this, Square initially extended the game's free trial from 1 month to 2, and then indefinitely until its new version 2.0, which is aimed at creating what is essentially a brand new game to its fans. So there we have it, all 14 main core games of the series Final Fantasy have been covered. Square has gone from being a company on the edge of bankruptcy, creating one final game 25 years ago, to being one of the largest and most successful role-playing game companies in the world. Its merger with the Enix Corporation, whilst not entirely favoured by fans, has definitely sought to increase the company's hold on the gaming industry in Japan and other territories. Let us just hope that when the final version of Final Fantasy XIV is released, the series will have regained the loyalty of its fans all around the world. And remember, that as long as there are heroes in the darkest of times, ever loyal chocobos and friends to stand by our side in the battle against evil, we will return to experience newer, more fantastic stories in the future from Square Enix. Okay guys, so this episode concludes the history of Final Fantasy. I do hope that you all enjoyed it, as it took a lot of time and effort to put together. So please feel free once again to leave a comment below or on Facebook and Twitter to give your input on what gaming series should be covered next. So, if you want more history of shows, honest game previews, reviews and much more every Friday, then be sure to subscribe to the Honest Gamer channel. And as always, it is The Honest Gamer here, and happy gaming.